Hello, everybody. I just thought this being a casual thing. I just want to have a little general conversation while I just do something in the background. Yeah, things are being okay on my end. University's good. Doing some university things. Had some interviews to do recently. Yeah. And for example, recently I did 7 interviews for my first assignment under journalism. Right now I'm on break from uni anyway, so that's why I actually am so free right now. I don't have to go into classes 3 times a week right now. Next week I will need to do that, and then in like 2 months I'll be going overseas anyway. So when I'm overseas, I also plan to try and put up something from when I'm overseas as well. So yeah, I hope everyone is fine to the most part. As I said, I just want to have a little conversation mostly. I do. Is there any? I just find the world, the things going on it right now are not exactly ideal in terms of what's happening. Because I have this election, right? And what makes it really annoying, especially in this circumstance, is that we have, in some cases, a genuine where ultimately some of the parties in this election have actually some genuinely good ideas. But the saddest part about them is what good ideas are surrounded by completely trash right-wing nationalism. And that is where the issue, I think, is that there is some genuinely good ideas by some of the minor parties. And that is the issue of the Australian political system, I guess, is that fundamentally, be it good or not, doesn't necessarily matter, especially in some cases. I just honestly wonder how the election is going to turn out, genuinely, because right now it seems that the corporate media is now attacking anyone who isn't conservative parties. Conservative parties is Liberal, National, United Australia Party. But that saying, though, does that necessarily mean that the other parties are going to be absolutely amazing? Absolutely not. Other parties, in terms of, like, for example, Labour Party and Greens, are not ideal either. So there's no point trying to then turn around and say it's amazing, the other parties. And that is the really annoying part about all this, I guess, is that honestly, for someone who cares about genuine dignity and peace, there's not much in terms of just having genuine movements towards that direction. And that is a sad part of it, I guess, that Australia, because it favors elitism to such an extreme degree that it's honestly sad. Elitism in Australian politics is sadly too rampant, and that makes this whole situation, at least for now, really not ideal by any standards. For example, now we have a situation in which Scott Morrison, of course, probably won't be able to survive this because he made too many errors and became too corrupt. But that does not necessarily mean that he can't hinder or weaken other voting trends right now. And that is the sad thing, is that that's also the sad thing about all of this, is that of what good there can be is now just becoming a depressing reality in some cases, in which some groups with regards to selection will never be represented. Some groups are just always going to be outsiders, and the election that won't change that. What does matter, though, is that the one that technically gets in does the most common good, I guess. Because if you're expecting like some like radical change or like or some massively socialist revolution or so on, something like that isn't going to happen with the way the Australian system actually does operate. And it's sad in that aspect. And that's where I think it's a really unideal situation for a lot of people in this selection, is that, yeah, and first actually reminded me, they use comparisons of trying to compare it to the Trump Clinton election situation, right? Sorry, correction. The Biden Trump situation in the US. How essentially people might then support one person over another just by virtue of not being that person, in which part of me does think, sure, but it's still not ideal. But also then again, what choice do we have as normal people? We are not exactly people who have a lot of power in this country as civilians. And ultimately as well is that the power imbalance is so severe in terms of those who have power and those who don't. It honestly does concern me that there's a growing inequality with regards to Australian politics as a whole, in that we have whole subsects of society dividing up now into, which is part of how capitalists get power, obviously. But at the same time, that does not necessarily mean it's a good thing. Diversity in this context does not mean that it will be a better country afterwards. Is there a potential of stopping all the bullshit and chaos that came with the multiple years under Liberal governments, and which has caused more reliance on systems of welfare? Yes, that's true about the Liberal Party. But the thing to understand most of all as well is that the reforms, even the Labour Party or a coalition of smaller independent parties can do is not that much in terms of impact. They can do something, of course. And I'm sure so they might do one or two okay things. But fundamentally, they still represent the same system. They still want to safeguard the same system in which has screwed over many people. And that is the sad reality of all of this. The sad reality also is fundamentally that as people, some people will get swayed by lots of this bloodshed in terms of like lying about candidates and so on. And in that sense, I also find it very concerning that the Australian public has become so dumbed down to that extent, almost apolitical in some aspects. I just honestly find that aspect of it all very, what's the word? Disheartening. Of course, some people then in turn would have woken up and been fine. Absolutely. They are all good. But to the most part, the actual base in which gets the election and votes is pretty useless. Because most votes in this election and past elections are mere circumstantial. People voting often, in some cases, to vote just to get rid of someone else or to do something else so you can move on and maybe have a change of leadership. But the same system still rules. It's still pure capitalism. It's still going to be corporatism. And the whole system of welfare capitalism isn't going to be vanished, even under a liberal party win or a small party victory. And that is going to be the sad part about all this as well, is that as much as Social Security can help, it can also completely hinder. I honestly do worry that as I was saying, I honestly do worry that the people who often are now going to be affected by lots of this stuff now, and especially with growing inequality, is going to, and that is the reality of thing as well, is that the tragedy of all this, especially as it relates, is that it's this all very reeking of pure capitalist politics, isn't it? Divide and conquer everyone and then have people supporting each thing. Because then ultimately, whoever you support will still support the same end agenda. And of course, when I say that, of course, try and do something when you can to better society. Don't say with that then being completely apathetical or apolitical. Because to be political in times of growing crisis is to care more in some aspects than to not. And this is where I think a lot of people don't really understand much about the whole situation at hand, in which is this country is going in. Of course, to some degree, everything's fine. But of course, ultimately, oh, shit. Sorry. And I was saying, ultimately, of course, still care, but just understand also that, at least in terms of progress, we need to at least give some consideration to realities of what we are dealing with as a country. We're dealing with a situation in which the US is getting more and more rogue. We're dealing with more and more crises overall, emerging more severe natural disasters, geopolitical crisis caused by capitalist leaders who want to pledge loyalty to the US. All that stuff isn't going to be beneficial for anyone necessarily. And I do worry that all of that in turn will negatively affect our future as a country. Anyway, let's be outside that. University itself is going fine, and I got exams are coming up in week 13. So they're like so I got like a month and a bit till then, I think. And that is gonna be fine. In terms of assignments, some are really quite weird so far, I guess. And I do honestly wonder what the purpose of some are, to be honest. Because there's one subject in which theoretically sounds okay. It's a mandatory one, of course, so I have to do it. But as a whole, I won't apply it anywhere else really. Because it's too abstract as a mindset and as a thing. It's also really, really, what's the word? Coincidental in terms of purpose. It's not exactly one of the, for example, it's not exactly gonna be world changing or a thing. Is it philosophically interesting? Absolutely. But is it going to be like world breaking? No, because people who have their minds on something won't change their mind for no reason. So it's like, and this is where philosophy is important, but those who study philosophy more seriously should also understand that I think that they don't have infinite ability to spread, because philosophy is only cared out for those who care about philosophy. Philosophy can then ultimately ignore political reality, can ignore social reality. Of course, sometimes it's not, and sometimes it can be a better thing. But fundamentally, does it necessarily mean that, well, it's wholly useless? No. It's just role for me, and in terms of what I pursue in life, is very minimal. And anyway, I was also looking back at the whole Ukraine shit, right? And this is where I find the whole analogies of Hitler and Russia very fucked. Because if you follow like the logic of like Western mainstream media, right? Yeah, you could say that, but then if you look at the actual reality of events, it's clearly not so. Because if you actually look at reality, it's clear that, because there's his history here. So I think history is pretty important to understand. Because if you understand how the Nazis got power and how they expanded so quickly, it was because of lying. They lied, they fabricated, and fundamentally, they refused to develop a honest base of expansion. They said they were doing one thing with the thing, try and get the others to withdraw, feed lies, and then fundamentally, then turn back, attacking straight away. People shouldn't, and that's why I'm saying people really should understand reality of events. Because if you understand reality of events, you understand very clearly that the ones who actually more like the Nazis, especially in the Ukraine crisis right now, early on, was Ukraine. And again, that's no real enormous surprise, is it? Because ultimately, Ukraine has been having inbuilt more right-wing elements anyway, especially since the 2014 coup. And that is the serious issue as well. I think people forget is that it's just the sad reality of things, isn't it, today, is that truth can be so easily distorted and thrown out just because of popular opinion. And public opinion and popular opinion then can be a completely messed up dynamic. I do want to see, and it does make me worry about the future in some aspects, because then, if that's going to be the trend overall, any real general change is going to be destroyed by the same people who want to say they care about people. And that is, I think, the grievous issue, I think, going on today, is that we are dealing with now with a situation in which people need to be more vigilant as a whole. We can't be so weak-minded when it comes down to things. We need to try and do something as a people, as a whole. We can't just sit back, pray to whatever thing you want to pray to, and think praying will do anything. Only human action will ever do anything. I'll be back in 2 seconds. I'll get a book quickly. Wasn't one quote. Let me try and find it quickly. Here we go. When the popular masses are guided by a progressive idea, they can be a powerful creator of history. Of course, it does not mean all progressive ideas play the same role in socio-historical development. Their role is different according to how they represent the aspirations and interests of the popular masses and how correctly they show path which must be followed in struggle. There were ideas which reflected the aspirations of progressive classes of society, even for the emergence of working class, but due to their historical and class limitations, the trend of thought in the past stage could not but be hampered in the role they played in social development. That I think was an interesting quote I found. Especially about progressive politics, and that's where I think progressive politics needs to be reimagined and relearned, I think, by some people. But being progressive isn't just a label or thing. It's being actively weaponized by some people completely. And people need to stop being fooled by a lot of this stuff going around about how we are all supposed to just be all kumbaya with each other. Issues in society exist. And of course, there are some groupings in which, of course, some things aren't going to be understood anywhere near enough. And that is where I think the issue is. Because for example, how family who works in the society industry speaks about some people who've come from like super Muslim countries, right? Is that some of the people they work with are socially isolated quite severely by the very fact that fundamentally they're so bound by sexist standards. For example, one person there just has to take being verbally abused by even her own son, all for the sake of culture. And that is why I think the whole thing about understanding others in culture needs to be really, really understood here. Because you can't just say it's culture and then do the most fucked up bullshit. You need an okay standard to some degree. If you don't have an okay standard, what are you then? You're nothing more than just a hypocrite who's just blind to issues. What then are you standing for? And also, as much as I may support LGBT stuff, it isn't everything like some is. Of course, though, to some who focus on it, that's completely fine because they work with lobbies and activist groups to try and advance things. But for others in this field, they need to step back and look at their own reality first. Not everything can be rosy and lovely. Is it going to be a wonderful thing in life? No, life is not rosy. Life is very often the opposite of rosy. You can't rely on thinking that life can be a utopia by any standards. You need to have a situation in which you have a reality understood. You understand that you're dealing with a situation in which, frankly, you can't win everything. And that is also, and that's the thing. As much as diversity and so on can be good, it needs to be understood perfectly clear that you can't warp and misunderstand that completely to mean another form of cultural imperialism. And that is, I think, the issue is that, especially with some liberals, is that in how they act as almost cultural imperialists. Because it's fine in some cases domestically, sure, but then they take the shit overseas, and then overseas people don't like it much, rightfully so. And that is a critical thing to understand, especially about recent affairs. I just honestly wonder how some of them live themselves, right? Because because some of them have like really shady NGOs. Amnesty International is a prime example. Shady as fuck NGO. I can't honestly say that as NGOs go, they are reliable, because they obviously aren't. They only support, for example, certain things, and of course, there's other ones that suffer aside from Amnesty International, as they are only merely one grouping. But the implication is still there. And people should not be so dumb about it. Because people like Amnesty International want to fight for something and want to undermine people for their own gain. And that is the reality in which people are living under. Because honestly, a lot of these NGOs like Amnesty International would like to support are often not necessarily people who deserve it. They focus on them, but then completely ignore other people in turn. And that's something that needs to be understood. Because for every group that's got massive support by Western NGOs, there's others which are completely abandoned. And that needs to be critically understood, especially in light of the situation in which a lot of our global situations are in contextually. And that's why naivety can't be had, especially when it comes down to conflict. Of course, nothing is perfect. Everything's going to have some degree of weirdness. But to trust NGOs so blindly, and to think in turn also that you're going to have like super amazing realities, that is just stupid. Because we deal with, and we are forced to live with, capitalist realism. We need to then understand in turn that we can't play nice and think utopian. We need to think realistically about society. And that's what the NGOs don't seem to understand. Because honestly, have you ever tried reading Amnesty International letters to foreign governments? Because if you honestly have, you'd honestly understand why they sound so much like death threats half the time. because they use such threatening language to try and pursue what they want. They use language to imply that they're going to go after them and coup them, which isn't necessarily far from the truth in some cases. I just find it absolutely comical. It's just a very sad fatal reality how NGOs, in some cases, can be just tools, can miss the whole point entirely, and then, as a direct result, just be nothing more than that, a sham. And that is the sad part. And that's why, for example, I don't think anyone necessarily in the right mind should support certain groupings. Of course, when I say you can ignore, discredit, and move on, duh. But the point still stands. And also, there's another thing I found interesting in commentary. Self-reliance in defense is a fundamental principle of independent foreign state. A state without self-reliance, armed forces capable of defending the country from the enemies at home and abroad, when imperialists cannot, in fact, be called a complete independent sovereign state. Imperialism is a constant cause of war and the main force of aggression, and war today is US imperialism. And that's where I think independence is also really and also there's as well. Building an independent national economy means building an economy which is free from dependence and on others, and which stands on its own feet. An economy which serves one's people and develops the strength of the resources of one's country and by efforts of one's own people. Such an economy makes it possible to develop the productive forces quicker by utilizing nation's natural resources in a rational and integrated way. Improved people's living standards consistently strengthen the material and technical foundations. That I think is also something which you don't necessarily get under a lot of these capitalist regimes as well nowadays, is that they outsource things way too much as a whole, that it's all very much a case of like, what then is there for the future in their case? What then do we have for our future? Are we still in control of ourselves, or are we just puppets for someone else's game? And that is something I think a lot of people need to understand quite quickly if they want to even comment about the state of affairs nowadays in a lot of pro-capitalist countries. You can't be nowadays all about wanting sovereignty and so on while advocating an extreme capitalist position, because extreme capitalist positions rely on there not being economic sovereignty. Because fundamentally, it's a massive contradiction. To have true sovereignty would be to not necessarily be would not be self-servicing to a lot of these conglomerations in which impact much of what we do today. That's something I think people will need to understand very well, especially about our situation that we are walking into with today. We just need to see reality for what it is. People need to wake up. People need to see what things are. People need to refocus, because that is also the thing in which we should do. Try to educate, try to get better education, try to be better as a person, try to contribute to something. And that is, I think, what we can do on my end, on our end as people. But in terms of like national sense, national wise, that is a much, much harder question. What is there in that we can feasibly do? Well, that is the much harder question in which people need to wake up to in reality. We can no longer necessarily be all thinking that like one party in a capitalist system will represent us entirely. We need to face a reality check in a way, which shows and show that we can be better and we can be our own sovereign self, especially in a climate where we have not much sovereignty. And with that, that's basically what we'll say for now.